we're going to get started. I know people are trickling in, and we're going to keep admitting them. Amy is on admit duties for us, but we wanted to get started so that we had as much time as possible for this presentation and for questions. So I'm going to jump right into our introduction of our guests today, and then we will move forward with Jen's presentation. So Jen Zuckerman's current role is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Duke University's World Food Policy Center and focuses on people-first policy development for equitable food policies. In addition to her position at the World Food Policy Center, she contracts with the BWA Emergent Equity, facilitating white caucuses in nonprofit and philanthropic organizations. She also contracts with DEI Works Collective in the capacity of a racial equity facilitator. She concentrates specifically on the role of white women and our complacency in upholding white supremacy culture. Jen serves on the board of the Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Funders Network and Communities in Partnership. She also serves as the chair of the Center for Environmental Farming Systems Advisory Board, the secretary of Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation Board of Directors. So with all of that fantastic experience, Jen is going to lead us through a presentation today entitled Examining Whiteness in the Food System, and I will be sharing our screen so that Jen has the ability to moderate the chat during our participatory sections. So I'm going to share my screen and hand it over to Jen.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And thank you so much to everyone for having me here today and for both your interest and your enthusiasm in this work. I know that Megan offered a little bit of my background and my resume, but, I come to you today, honestly, as someone who's in a learning space with you. So I hope you kind of see me as a partner in learning with you. And I can't imagine that anyone can be an expert in this space, but definitely we can all be open to kind of a collective understanding and learning. And so that's kind of the frame that I just want to offer to everyone here today to start. But before I get into the presentation, I do want a couple really important acknowledgements. First, I do want to acknowledge the land on which I'm sitting. So I'm coming to you from Durham, North Carolina, and I am on the unceded land of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation. And Duke University is actually situated directly on the ancestral hunting grounds of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation. So this work that we've developed has been in partnership with two members enrolled members of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation. And so we've tried to be true to the land and the people's land on which we sit as we've moved through this. Second, I also want to acknowledge the intellectual capital that really built this. So I'm here presenting, and I am a face and a part of a collaborative group, but the intellectual development of this really started with a group of amazing people here in Durham. Those folks include Cameron Smith, who's the Executive Director of Communities in Partnership in Durham, Vivette Jeffries Logan, who is one of the co-founders of BWA Emergent Equity, Justin Robinson, who is a member of the Earthseed Collective, and Kamal Bell, who is the owner of Sankofa Farms. And then this actual research brief that I think a lot of you have already read was written by Allison Conrad, and she did this as part of her Master's of Public Policy at Duke University in partnership with us at the World Food Policy Center. And she's actually working now for the USDA around SNAP policy. So still connected to this work. Next slide, please. So what I want to talk through a little bit here is just how we'll get through the conversation today. And there are going to be a number of stop points for us, Zoom or whatever this is, Teams, is so weird to have actual interaction, but I do try to have some break points so we can process a little bit together, which is why Megan's been so awesome as to run the presentation for me so that I could also see the chat, because we'll go through the presentation today and I'll ask some questions and you'll just kind of chat in your response, and all of them are kind of like A, B, C, D responses. And I also don't jump immediately into the white narrative. So I know that the research brief that you might have been connected to already is specific to the white narratives. But what we found is it really makes a lot of sense to understand first the research framing. So why did we jump into this? Then get on the same page about what it is that we're talking about, these key definitions that we're unwinding through those white narratives. And then the history is such an important part. And I'll speak just about 4 specific policies in that history, but really emphasize that where we are today is the result of the history of our country. And then we'll get into the narratives. We're going to try and hit 2 or 3. I do want to leave time at the end for question and answer, so we might stop at 2. And then we'll talk about what's next. Like I said, this is continuous learning and a journey for all of us. So I'll offer some recommendations for what's next, but also interested in your thoughts on what's next. So next slide, please. And you can go back to research framing. Thank you. Yeah. So first, I want to name specifically how I come to this work. Megan did kind of talk about my background in terms of where I have worked specifically, but I do want to name that I'm a white, cisgender, Jewish, middle-class woman. My family's from New York, but I was born and raised in the South here in North Carolina. My background is in nonprofit work and in philanthropic work. And while I've always worked from a relationship-based perspective, I never even knew to start looking at my own whiteness or my own privilege until I really came to Duke about 5 years ago and started the work that I'll talk through with everyone today. So again, I am not an expert. I am deep in this learning and I'm learning with you. And what's important about this research is that this research is rooted in peer-reviewed research, and it's also rooted in experiential research. So we really like to kind of marry those two at the World Food Policy Center. And just the background on how this came to be. When I started at the World Food Policy Center in 2017, I was charged with making Durham a model food community. And that made a lot of sense to me based on where I had been and work that I had done before. And the whole framing was, hey, try and see how we can get all of the policies and practices right in one community and see if that's something that we could offer to other communities as something to model, something to replicate. And so I really thought that was innocuous. I thought it was objective. I thought it made sense. And then I stepped 1 foot off of Duke University's campus. And the first person that I engaged with was actually one of the women I mentioned on our first slide, Cameron Smith with Communities in Partnership. And the first question that Cameron asked me was, well, whose model and for whom? And that really got me thinking, I never even knew to ask that. I just assumed that a model was a model. And so I was lucky to be in relationship with Cameron and in relationship with the other folks that I mentioned. And they really helped us frame, they said, we're not really interested in making Durham a model food community. But if you're interested in seeing how you can leverage the power and privilege of Duke University to help decolonize food in Durham, we're in with you on that journey. And so that's really been the impetus for this research. And it's really refocused the role of myself, my own work, and our organization. So since then, I've been unpacking my own whiteness, our organization, the World Food Policy Center, as part of Duke University. We've been trying to unpack our own whiteness and what it is that we uphold, what it is that we replicate. A couple of notes about this research. It was done in a US context, which is relevant to all of us here in terms of where we're specifically working, but there's not a global context to this, so that does have some differences. And then this research was also specifically done through the lens of race. So it does not include an intersectional analysis. It does not include a class analysis, and it does not include a gender analysis or other levels of analyses. So I just wanted to name that specifically. And then as we're going through this presentation, I want to again note that this is about a learning and about a calling in. And this is not a pointing fingers of oh, I can't believe you're doing this, because we're all doing it. And we've historically done it. And the goal of naming these narratives is, if you don't name it, you can't know that it's there. So we're trying to just see it. And then we're trying to understand the history that's created these dynamics and to be able to reckon with that, just so that we can choose to move differently. And this really is an examination and to try and understand both ourselves and the difference between our intent and our impact. Next slide, please. So the policy question that we were trying to get to as under this framework of decolonizing food was, how do white supremacy culture narratives show up in food insecurity and food access work? And to answer this question, Ali conducted, as I said before, rooted in literature, so a comprehensive literature review, and then coupling that literature with lived experience. So she also interviewed food justice leaders from across the US. And then as a result of that compilation of literature and food justice interviews, she identified 8 themes that were both in the literature and in the interviews. And those themes all show up in that research brief. And then we'll talk specifically about 2 or 3 of those today. And again, as we go through, and I'll keep saying this because there's different things that are going to show up for each of us as we go through the presentation, and some of it's really triggering. And I will really try and explain the definition, so what I'm talking about and why I'm talking about it. But if you have questions, please definitely put those in the chat. And as feelings come up for you, I always try and lean into those feelings as opportunities for curiosity, because I have them too all the time. I'll hear something and it hits me hard, and then I need to figure out why it's hitting me hard. So next slide, please. So to answer this question of how do we decolonize food and how does white supremacy culture show up in food insecurity work, it was critical for us to really understand this concept of whiteness and how we can start to unpack whiteness. And getting this understanding that whiteness is an ideology, and it's based on these beliefs, values, behaviors, and habits and attitudes that result in this unequal distribution of power and privilege based on skin color. And we'll talk a lot about power and privilege and how that rolls into decision making as we move forward. And naming for myself that as a white woman, I've benefited from whiteness at the expense of other people for my entire life. But it's only, as I mentioned, recently, that recognizing it and naming it as this active social construct, not something individuals are doing to one another, but something that's happening, that I'm able to even start seeing it. And then what happens within whiteness is that it takes unlearning to recognize how we've all been socialized into white supremacy culture. And this is irrespective of race. And then relearning, so relearning about this history of systemic racism so that we can start to operate differently. And this idea of operating differently is the key here, because it's not just about what you know. It's about how you show up differently as a result of what you know. And my friend Vivette Jeffries Logan, who was part of this amazing team that I've gotten to work with here in Durham, the phrase that she uses will always stick with me. And, you know, learning how to not operate in whiteness is just about, as she says, how you be. So as you're going through, think about how you be in different spaces. Next slide, please. So there are really specific ways in which whiteness shows up in the food system. And with my entire history of working in the food system, when I started learning about this, it surprised the heck out of me, and it also made so much sense. And so this is an excerpt from Rachel Slocum, and she's a preeminent researcher on whiteness in food. And so I would highly advise looking up a lot of her research if you're interested in learning more. She talks specifically how whiteness permeates the food system in the ways that it articulates these white ideals of health and nutrition. And so that shows up in our narrative of good and bad foods. And then it also offers these whitened dreams of farming and gardening that erase both the past and the present of race in agriculture. And then what whiteness does is also it mobilizes funding to predominantly white organizations to then direct programming towards or on behalf of non-white beneficiaries. And we'll talk about this later also in the communities can't take care of themselves. And then what it also does is it creates these inviting spaces for white people. What whiteness does is it centers whiteness. And we can't really imagine something different. And these are probably a lot of the issues that you're struggling with. I think maybe next week you're going to have a presentation on farmers markets. And I know historically, farmers markets and community gardens that have been, kind of to this point of mobilizing funding towards predominantly white organizations, you create a white space. And then you're struggling to figure out how to add diversity to that space, or why don't more fill in the blank folks show up to our program, our initiative, our space. So this is something that we're all struggling with. We've got this system that's centered in whiteness, and it reinforces whiteness, but then we're trying to apply equity over the top of it. And everyone is frustrated. So just naming this frustration that I know that I have, and I feel like you're probably having in your work as well. Next slide, please. So just wanted to take a minute, I know I've been talking for a while, about what ways you might have seen whiteness show up in your work. And you can just drop into the chat, it can be A, B, C, D. There's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. It's just what ways you might have seen it, and thinking about things like who's leading programming versus who's receiving programming, considered an expert and what expertise means. You might not know. You might not know how this is relevant to the food system, and that's okay. We're all learning this. And you also might still not be familiar with this term. I know we've really only done like 2 slides and might not be sure how you feel about it. So if you want to drop a couple of those of your ideas into the chat, I'll try and see. Yeah, a lot of A and B. Oh yeah, Jonathan, yeah, where meetings are held. Very good. Thanks for adding a new one. Yeah, Jody. Yeah, the nutritional guidelines and nutritional education delivery. We're definitely going to be talking about that more. And I think Jody, to your point, I know there's also a lot of limitations if you have SNAP funding about who can do what, where and how. So, we're thinking about what systems are we operating in and how do we kind of move both within and kind of push against those. Yeah. Thanks for that engagement, everyone. And please continue to think about this as you're going forward. Yeah, agenda items, or I would even say having agendas. So next slide, we'll keep going. Because what I want to do next is just kind of establish a little bit of shared language that we can use and keep using beyond this. And within these definitions, I'm focusing on systems and ideologies. I am not focusing on individual people. And that's why this is such a complex system to unwind, because, if this was really about one person not knowing something and then knowing something new as a result, I believe that'd be an easier fix. But when we're dealing with entrenched ideologies and entrenched systems, that's why we're trying to unwind this Gordian knot that we're all in. Next slide, please. So I'm sure that folks are familiar with and have used the term BIPOC, and I want to acknowledge first that it's not a perfect term, but it is the term that we used in the research brief. So I want to make sure that we're defining it here, and acknowledge that it stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And it's framed this way, placing Black and Indigenous people first, to acknowledge that not all people of color faced equal levels of injustice, and that here in the United States, Black and Indigenous people have faced the worst consequences of white supremacy, classism, and settler colonialism. And also to acknowledge that we use this term to address the issue that people of color are not a monolithic group. And within any group, it's not a monolithic group. So just naming that we're talking with and about people, and this is the term that we're using when we're talking about a grouping that's not a monolithic grouping. Next slide, please. So white supremacy culture is something that I really recommend taking some time to do some deep learning on this. This has been something that I know nationally, just the term triggers folks, understanding why are you saying white supremacy within something? Because most often the term white supremacy brings to mind the Klan or white nationalists. And then people stop and shut down because you hear white supremacy and you say, well, that's not me. I'm not racist. And this is not about individual racism. This is about the idea or ideology that white people and the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of white people are inherently superior to people of color and their ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions. And it's reproduced in all the institutions in our society. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get to our next definition. But these attitudes and behaviors that stem from white supremacy culture can also be found in any individual. They can be found in any group, any organization, and whether it's a white-led organization, predominantly white-led, BIPOC-led, or has predominantly BIPOC staff, everyone in the United States has been impacted by white supremacy culture. So naming it and understanding it is also helpful to understanding what's showing up when these conflicts are arising. Next slide, please. So building on that concept that white supremacy culture is reproduced in all of our institutions is this concept of structural racism. And structural racism is this normalization and legitimization of these array of dynamics. And what these dynamics do is they routinely advantage whites while producing both cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. And so think about things that you're working on, such as the racial health gap, the racial wealth gap, or racial disparities in food insecurity are the result of structural racism. And what structural racism does is it has these reinforcing effects of these multiple institutions and cultural norms, both from the past and from the present. And it reproduces old and produces new forms of racism at all times. So structural racism is adaptive. We aren't operating in the same structural racism that we've operated in the past because it adapts to the realities of today. So there's never an end point to understanding it. That's why I definitely claim never to be an expert, because there's no way to understand all of it. It's constantly shifting. And it's really important to understand the terms specifically of white supremacy culture and structural racism, because the goal is to move us beyond this idea that racism is something that only bad people do. If that's what we think, we won't ever move differently in our spaces. We won't be differently. White supremacy culture and structural racism affect all of us, the work that we do. And these changes that we're trying to make in this framework of existing and historic structural racism and white supremacy culture. So now we're going to try and look at how we got here and then how we can move together differently. Next slide, please. I do want to get a little more specific on some definitions too, as it relates to foods. Yes, and I'm happy to give you access to the slides afterwards. So food desert, is a term coined by the USDA. And food desert is something that I used a lot, particularly in my past work in philanthropy. But food desert is really this misnomer of what's going on in communities, because a food desert implies that these food access and food insecurity issues are these natural phenomenon. Like it was just going to happen no matter what, as opposed to acknowledging that these areas where there are higher rates of food insecurity and lower access to food have been created by intentional policy and practice. Food desert also implies that these communities are lacking. When communities are filled with human beings doing amazing things. And so desert is really this misnomer. Food apartheid is a term that was coined by activist Karen Washington, and she looks at the food system as this part of the larger culture, and it broadens the conversation to acknowledge these social and racial inequities and name specifically that policies, practice, and systems have created these inequities. Next slide, please. And I love this quote from Karen Washington, because as we think about, well, gosh, if this was the result of historic policies and practice and continued policies and practice and disinvestment, what do we do? And I've just highlighted a couple aspects of her quote in terms of invest in the people who already live in these communities, instead of coming in and changing the dynamics and complexions of these neighborhoods. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, I'm curious if folks are familiar with the term food apartheid. I've done this presentation a number of times, and across the board, it's new to some folks. It's not new to some folks. Some folks have heard it, but didn't quite know what the differentiation was. So I'm just interested in kind of where you might be in that. Right, yeah, we're all across the board, either using it exclusively, using it interchangeably, or not really familiar with the framing. That absolutely makes sense. You're kind of, we're all in this together in terms of being all over the place. Next slide, please. So I do want to go into history because history is so important to understand how to decolonize food, because we have to understand, well, how did we get here in the first place? So next slide, please. And I'm not going to go into all the details of this slide, but today's racially stratified food system is a direct result of a history of public policy decisions. And understanding our racialized history and the impacts of policies, I know it's not something I ever learned in my formal education, and I don't think it's something that is commonplace for most folks to be learning in their own formal educations. And while this slide here is multiple, probably a 3-hour presentation in its own right, I'm going to, after this, name 4 specific policies. But I do encourage you on our World Food Policy Center website, and I can send these as follow-up resources. We did a comprehensive food history of Durham called Power and Benefit on the Plate, which names a lot of these policies and practices. And I encourage you to dive into that. We've got a timeline as well. But then there's 3 other books that I have found incredibly helpful. One is Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. Another is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. And the third is The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. And those all give you this deep analysis of racialized policy and the impact on people and communities. Next slide, please. So for our purposes today, I'm going to mention 4 different policies, 2 on land and 2 on home ownership, because this is really how wealth has been built here in the United States. So the first one is actually a global policy, and it was a papal decree. So issued by Pope Alexander VI in 1483 was the Doctrine of Discovery. And what the Doctrine of Discovery was this unilateral decree of international law. What it did was it categorized indigenous people as subhuman because they were not Christian, and then it treated their land as unoccupied and therefore available for the taking. So what this policy did globally was open the floodgates for colonizing, for genocide, for enslavement, and for the destruction of cultures and communities globally. What it also did was provide the scaffolding for the founding of the United States, rooted in stolen land. Next slide, please. So building on the idea of land as something essential for building wealth here in the United States, the Homestead Act of 1862 granted 160 acres of indigenous nations land to any predominantly white American who applied and worked it for 6 years. So as a result, 246 million acres of Western Native lands became privately owned. And of the 1.6 million landowners created by this act, fewer than 6,000 of those were Black. Next slide, please. So moving on to home ownership, which is a second factor in wealth building here in the United States, and prior to redlining, and that's something that I'll discuss next, communities instituted racial covenants, and this was starting in the 1920s, and these were legal through 1948. But I will say there are a lot of communities who maybe don't know that these still exist. These covenants still exist. And so while they are no longer legally enforceable, a lot of them are still on the books. And this image here is actually from the Hope Valley neighborhood, which is about 2 miles from where I'm sitting right now here in Durham. And this is from 1926. And what this states is that this 7th article indicates that the premises shall not be occupied by Negroes or persons with Negro blood, provided that this shall not be construed to prevent the living upon the premises of any Negro servant, whose time is employed for the domestic purposes of the occupants of the dwelling home, together with the family of such servant. So what this is saying is there is an explicit prohibition against Black home ownership in this neighborhood. However, if a white family has a Black domestic servant, that person may live in that home with the white family. And so this was just such an explicit statement of who can own homes. And again, like I said, while this was specific to Durham, it's also not specific to Durham. Next slide, please. So I think redlining is probably something a lot of you have heard about in some way, shape, or form. And it was from between 1935 and 1940. What was happening is that the federal government was trying to stabilize the economy as a result of the Great Depression. And so it was getting into the home ownership market. And it worked with this homeowners loan corporation to create these neighborhood risk maps. And this was the way the federal government was then entering the housing market. And what these maps did, and not all communities have these maps. This is a map of Durham. These maps colored red as unsuitable for loans and unsuitable for public investment. So again, like thinking about food apartheid and not having public investment, it marked neighborhoods that were Black, mixed race, and neighborhoods that might invade white neighborhoods as redlined neighborhoods. And so as a result of these redlined maps, between 1935 and 1968, less than 2% of federally insured, so government insured home loans went to Black people. And in many cities today that have these maps, you can almost directly overlay a redlining map with the USDA term coined food desert maps, and they're almost one in the same. And so, these were just 4 examples of racialized policies and practice that have created this racial wealth gap. I was in a presentation from Dr. Henry McCoy at North Carolina Central the other week, and his data shows that Black Americans by percentage have, right now it's a 13-to-1 wealth gap between white and Black, and Black Americans have by percentage the same amount of wealth that they collectively held at emancipation. So since 1865, there has been no by percentage increase in Black wealth here in the United States. So that says we're not doing what we want to do, what we say we want to do. We have this inequitable system and an inequitable food system. So we need to understand this history and then start to reckon with, okay, well, then what are we doing as a result? Next slide, please. So curious for folks, in what ways you might have seen racialized policy and practice impact your local food system. This is actually the first time that I'm hearing and understanding this kind of policy connection to how it's showing up in programming. But if you have any experience or any thoughts, please drop in anything, whether it's around disparities in these food insecurity rates, access to food. Something that we've been working on a lot is this issue of access to capital. And then what we've also been investigating a lot is this deep reliance on food charity to address hunger, as opposed to looking at the actual roots of why folks are hungry. All. Yes. Well, for the sake of time, we'll keep moving through, but and the long-awaited white supremacy culture narratives. So we'll probably, I'm going to talk about them all from a high level, and then we'll get into we might just get into one, maybe two, and then because I want to leave some time for Q&A. So high level, next slide, please. What this slide shows is on the left, these aspects of white supremacy culture, which you can read more about if you look up information on white supremacy culture, and I can also send follow-up resources. But all of these narratives stem from specific aspects of white supremacy culture. So thinking about things like individualism, which stresses the needs of the individual over the group of the whole. And it also emphasizes that people should just be able to solve their own problems, and then pathologizes them when they can't. Paternalism involves interfering with an individual's or a community's ability to choose and make decisions. And it does have this objective of trying to improve the welfare of individuals, but what it often does is it involves making decisions without people's consent. And then neoliberalism is this ideology, and it's also a policy model that emphasizes replacing entitlements with market-based solutions. And it really places value on free market competition, emphasizing personal responsibility and hard work. And all of this shows up in these different white supremacy culture narratives. And these are the narratives that Ali drew out through research and interviews. And they are, the idea of if they only knew, which focuses on education from the outside. Vote with your fork, which implies that your consumption signals your values. Communities can't take care of themselves, which brings in this external experts. Failure to listen, which denies solutions from those directly impacted. Build it and they'll come, which assumes needs and desires and then creates these white spaces to meet them. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which asserts that people should just take personal responsibility and work harder. A focus on food charity, which hones the logistics of a fundamentally inequitable system. And then good versus bad foods, which really ignores the genetic nutritional needs across cultures. Next slide, please. And so all of these narratives have in common this focus on programs that emphasize individual actions instead of looking at these bigger systems and structures. And they also reveal these unequal distributions of power, ownership, and decision-making in food policy and programming. So let's skip if they only knew. So we'll skip these next two slides. We'll talk a little bit about communities can't take care of themselves, and then I'm going to open it up to some Q&A after we just kind of talk a little bit about what's next. So communities can't take care of themselves, and this is something that just shows up again and again in the systems that we're working in. And it really, our systems reinforce this narrative that communities can't take care of themselves. So if you think about the terms, like if you're filling out a grant application, who's the subject matter expert and who's the target audience? This is how our systems really reinforce that communities can't take care of themselves. So thinking about why are people experts and why are people being targeted? And then within that, who then has the power to make decisions? And if you're making these decisions, what does that mean about whose ideas and ideals are being centered? Where the resources are directed, and therefore who holds the power. So I'll give just a specific example next. So next slide, and this is something that when I was in philanthropy, I made these investments time and time again because it was a best practice. So I was doing this work from the perspective of best practice, which is another reinforcing term that we'll need to unwind. But when I think about things like a mobile produce market, so harkening back to kind of that whiteness in food systems, I would invest in a white-led organization I would give them, money for staff. I would let them get this van. They could buy produce, and it would go into a majority BIPOC neighborhood. And folks, yes, would come out and get some produce, but then at the end of the day, this van drove away. And it went back to the organization where people's jobs, benefits, assets, capacity were being built. And it fully ignored any kind of community-led solution to growing their own food economy. And so this is something that, communities can't take their care of themselves is perpetuated in a lot of our programs, a lot of our policies, a lot of the ways that we do things, and a lot of the ways we position who's a subject matter expert, and all of the things that you've put in the chat already about who's setting the agenda, where things are held, who's getting the funding, and who's kind of at the front of the room and who's in the audience. So next slide, please, and we'll forward past the good versus bad food, and go to this next slide of what's next. So I do want to open it up to questions because there's a lot to unpack, and I'm glad to discuss more, and I'm glad to come back another time and talk more, like do version 2 where we go more deeply into those narratives. But the context for the narratives is so important to kind of ground yourself in what's showing up. Because the first thing you really have to do is just understand how systemic racism and white supremacy culture are built into our food system. And then recognize that both society and the food system, they're not race neutral spaces. So you can't apply race neutral solutions to race-based issues. And thinking about for yourself how whiteness and white supremacy culture have influenced your experience and your organization's experience in the food system and what's led you to your work today. And then the most important thing in moving forward and thinking about this is really always unpacking who's making the decisions. So who is making the decisions for whom? And then how does that impact the policies and programs that are being heralded? And then what does that mean about kind of your place in this space? So I will stop there. And I really appreciate everybody putting awesome stuff in the chat that are more resources. We've got lots of resources on our website at the World Food Policy Center. And also I'm glad to follow up with more information. So I'll stop there to see if folks have some questions.
It looks like in the chat, Robin has a question that she was invited to consider the phrase high priority food area to replace food desert. And she's wondering what your thoughts on that, or should food sovereignty be used exclusively?
So I have actually never heard the term high priority food area. The reason I use the term food apartheid is because food apartheid acknowledges the history of disinvestment, and high priority food area, to me, not knowing the actual definition of it, feels to me like it's still removing, one, how we got here, and two, where investment should go. So in terms of high priority food, still feels about access as opposed to ownership. And it's really about shifting power so that wealth and ownership can be built in community. And I do recommend, and I'll put this in the chat, one of the strategies that has a lot of clarity around it, around what it is and what it is not, is equitable food-oriented development, which is a very, very tangible way of how to shift power in communities. And it's being used. I'm actually meeting with another SNAP group who's really trying to figure out how to invest SNAP dollars from an equitable food-oriented development framework. So yeah. And so Jonathan, like, to me, EFOD is an example of better best practices. And also, again, that whole concept of who's making decisions for whom. And so we worked over COVID with a group of community-rooted leaders. And I use the term community-rooted, and I can also send that resource out. So community-rooted means that it is community-led and community accountable, and it includes folks who have been directly impacted in decision-making processes as part of the organizational structure. And that's compared to community-based organizations, which a lot of times have, predominantly white boards or, now diversifying boards, but it's typically been organizations that have been set up to do work on behalf of issues in communities. And so we worked with a number of community-rooted organizations on what's on our website called the Food Resilience Strategy. And all of the recommendations in the Food Resilience Strategy came from our community leadership, and they're all around mechanisms that are focused on shifting power and decision-making to community leadership. And so one example in there is an equitable food-oriented development fund. Another example in there is a tribal food sovereignty fund, and we were actually able to get $10 million in our state budget to go to that tribal food sovereignty fund, and that went directly to the 8 sovereign tribal nations here in North Carolina. Another example in there is a Black Farmer Fund, and there's actually in New York an operational Black Farmer Fund, and then also work specifically on a farm worker advocacy network and fund are some examples of these better best practices, which are all about how organizations can work in support of as opposed to on behalf of. So we've got skills, expertise, resources, and how do we move to shift so that we're just not making the decisions for other folks, but resourcing them instead. Antonia asked, how do we begin to change the narrative at a local level from food desert to food apartheid? I would recommend, it starts within your own work group. So the folks with whom you're working with on a daily basis, starting to have conversations about how to use that, because you've got to have a level of relationship and trust first with folks when you're kind of shifting that. And then any of the materials that we have here that have been helpful to you in terms of, okay, well, why should we use food apartheid as opposed to food desert? Please lean into that information. And then, I would also advise, there's a lot that Karen Washington has put out, and you can Google that, share that out. And then I also recommend, a lot of times this work is, folks who are on the front lines, and I'm making an assumption that based on how thoughtful all your questions are, that you're on the front lines struggling with this every single day. And it requires kind of organizing yourselves and being connected yourselves, and then pushing up to leadership, and then working with leadership to keep pushing up. Unfortunately, we're still in a system of pushing up, but I'm really excited. The Deputy Secretary of the USDA, Dr. Jewel Bernal, she spoke at an event that we had in April, and the commitment that she has to racial equity and unwinding racial inequity within the USDA is incredibly strong. She was the Commissioner of Agriculture in the Commonwealth of Virginia before going to the USDA, and I worked with her as she created this first legislated Healthy Food Access Fund that included a caveat around equitable food-oriented development. And I can send that legislation to you as well, because it's really powerful how she was working within this existing system of having to use the framework of healthy food access, but just every little bit that you can do in terms of asking those questions, shifting who's making decisions, and figuring out how you can leverage what you have access to do work in support of community organizations is, and just by being here today, to deepen your learning, I think you're doing a lot. So thank you. I know we've only got 3 minutes left. So Megan, I didn't know if there were any other questions or anything else, in these last 3 minutes where I can be helpful.
I don't personally have any additional questions. I would challenge everyone to take this information that Jen presented to us today and to reflect on it. Our webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the Indiana Grown for Schools website, along with a list of resources that were put in the chat today, and any additional things that Jen has for us as resources. So I did take some notes, and I will try to link as many things as I possibly can in our webinars page. But I thank you all very much for coming and engaging in this topic. I understand that these spaces can sometimes make us uncomfortable, but uncomfortability is where we grow. And so I really am thankful to have you guys all as partners in this work as we continue to learn and change the systems that we work in together. Naima, do you have anything else you'd like to add today as we close out today's webinar?
No, I was just typing a message in the chat. I have about 1 million questions. I think we could double your time and still not have enough. One thing that, I appreciate all of the resources that you shared. The EFOD framework is new to me, and I'm really excited to dive into those resources. That's really, I think, very salient for some of the work that we're both doing and wanting to fund right now. So if you have any other resources specifically related to equitable practices around funding and grant making, that would be much appreciated. That's a space where, we really struggle in as a state agency. We want to get money out, but we sort of reflexively pivot back to the same practices that we've always used to get money out, which are sort of inherently steeped in white supremacy culture. So really interested in some more resources related to that. But thank you so much, Jen. This has just been a wonderful presentation. I hope we get the opportunity to invite you again. I know that we would all benefit from that.
Well, I'd love to be here again. Thank you so much for asking me. And Naima, I have lots of those on equitable funding. And so we'll be glad to share those with you, and we'll share all the resources I mentioned in a follow-up email.
Thank you.
Great. Everybody have a great day.